Now, we know we've used lethal force because what? We are in fear of death or serious bodily injury or harm. So that's the only reason why us good guys with guns are going to use a firearm. So how are we going to be judged? If we are judged and we're judged before a jury, how are they going to do that? How are we going to slip into the skin of somebody from another state that we're not from? And how is a jury going to look at us? Well, have you ever heard of the reasonable man doctrine or the reasonable person standard? Simply what that standard is a standard by which the jury is going to deliberate how you acted were or how your reactions were to a given situation. There's a couple interesting things when we're talking about the reasonable man in a self-defense shooting. If you've ever been a jury or been on jury duty, you get jury instructions at the end of the trial. And specifically, they tell you not to slip in the shoes of the person. Don't put yourself in that person's situation because for most cases, you're the fact finder. You're just determining who's telling the truth and who's not. You're taking the facts and you're determining which ones are the true facts. And so the instructions you get are you have to remain unbiased, except for a self-defense shooting. Generally speaking, in a self-defense shooting, the jury instructions are going to include instructions that tells you feel free to step in the shoes of the person that used self-defense. What would you have done? And that's because in plain language, what the reasonable man doctrine states is that as a juror, you want to consider what a reasonable person under the same or similar circumstances, knowing what that person knew at the time, have acted the same way and used lethal force. Would us, a reasonable person, knowing the same thing that everybody else did in the same situation, would we have acted that way? If so, we're reasonable. We reasonably use self-defense. It's simple enough. We're reasonable people. In fact, statistically, we're the safest, most law-abiding segment of society. We know that. But, and there's always a but, the self-defense shooting took place in San Francisco. We're from Kennesaw, Georgia. If anybody knows anything about Kennesaw, Georgia, you are required to own a firearm. So trust me, the reasonable person in Kennesaw, Georgia is not the reasonable person in San Francisco. We can all agree. San Francisco, by the way, got rid of their last firearms deal that there's ever been in the city. So you can't even buy a gun in San Francisco. I always say, you know what? If you're from San Francisco, I'm not picking on anybody, but you're not reasonable. You're not like me, and you're not like most of us in here. And so that's what we do. We take a jury pool, or we take a city or a township, and we take everybody's thoughts, everybody's customs, the way we've been raised, who we are, and we mold that into the perfect person. And that's the reasonable person for that jurisdiction. But keep in mind, even though two cities in Ohio, Cleveland and Cincinnati, and I'm outside of Cincinnati, I'm pretty calm and pretty safe and secure in my Second Amendment rights. Joe Dieters in Hamilton County is a great prosecutor. The prosecutor in Butler County where I live is a great prosecutor. Their sheriffs are great. They think like me. They encourage us to be ready to protect ourselves. But if I go home to see mom and dad, I travel through Cleveland, Ohio, where if you mention a gun, it's like mentioning a bomb on an airplane. They're not like me and they're not like us. So you need a person that can help you out because the police, the prosecutor, and the judges, they don't have the same values, the same mores, they don't think like us. They're completely different. And that's a great example for me to use. So the reasonable person in Cincinnati, Ohio isn't the same as a reasonable person in Cleveland or Kennesaw, Georgia, and San Francisco. We're not the same. So how then do we step into the shoes of a reasonable person in San Francisco if we're from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or we're from New York City, or for wherever we're from? Well, that's why you have to have local counsel. Local counsel is one of the most important things that anybody can ever have. If you use a firearm in self-defense or you're involved in anything where you need an attorney, you need an attorney from where the incident took place, no matter what the incident is, for a lot of reasons. You need an attorney that knows every nook and cranny of the courthouse. You need an attorney who probably stroked a check to the judge's campaign. You need an attorney that probably campaigned for him, that knows every bailiff, that knows every person in that courthouse, and that you're there all the time and, hey, Sean, what are you doing? What are you here for? Well, I have a self-defense shooting. It's somebody that knows the prosecutor, knows what the prosecutor thinks like, knows what the judges think like. If not, you're going to get homered. Homered is a term that we use as an attorney, that we get in there and we're not treated fairly and we're not from here. And as an attorney, either I'm not going to represent you from a jurisdiction that they don't know me in, or I'm going to serve a second chair. You're going to have one attorney who was from that area, and then I'll be offering advice and counsel at that point in time. So that's how we become that fictitious reasonable person in a city that we're not used to. So we made a decision that we're in immediate, unavoidable fear of death or serious bodily injury or harm. We are forced to use lethal force in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm from Cincinnati. How do I become the reasonable person in Cleveland, Ohio? My attorney takes care of that and molds and says, you know what, folks? I understand what you're thinking, but this person was in fear of serious bodily injury and immediate death, and there was no other choice than to do this. And that's why your local counsel is one of the most important things that you can have.
If you own or carry a gun, you owe it to yourself and your family to be totally prepared. Second Call Defense gives you complete legal protection for armed self-defense. It's the most comprehensive protection for armed self-defense in America. Join Second Call Defense today.